with my speech here today, my little talk, I would also like to emphasize a little bit more sort of macroeconomic aspects. And you have the title there in front of you. Sort of, I think there are some lessons from the Nordic countries, but I also think there are some constraints here. I also think that the Nordics are not perfect, that not everything should be copied from there, for instance. But I have a few ideas that I think actually are done very well in the Nordics and that we could learn a lot from here. So allow me to try to jump into that. And here, you know, don't be offended or don't be angry or something like that when I keep saying there to the right that Latvia is not a Nordic country for whatever reason it is, spending, taxation, income equality, and so on. Because it doesn't mean that a Nordic country is necessarily a good country, right? I think it's the Nordic countries have many good things to say about them. The 4 countries that are or have been represented earlier here today, I mean, they are among the richest countries we have in the whole world. And part of that is due to their welfare system. There are also other reasons, of course. But not being Nordic doesn't mean that one is a complete loser or anything like that. That's absolutely not what I mean with this here, right? I just want to say that Latvia is different. And in some cases, I think that it should stay different. And in some cases, I think that it should move in a Nordic direction. Right? This is, if I look at sort of total government revenue, the newest I can get, 2011, for the Nordic countries and for the Baltics, and also for the EU, this is where we are. Basically, here in the Baltics, we choose to tax less than they do in the Nordics. And as you can see, the Nordics, they do tax, almost like to tax, more than almost anyone else. It's above the EU average. Here it's below the EU average. The number for Norway cheats a little bit. It's based on that 3-letter word that does all the difference for them, namely oil, right? So if I have a slightly better graph here, I can also look at, in green, expenditure versus revenue. But also there I get this thing that is not so surprising, right? The green and the blue are almost the same, except for Norway, where revenue is much larger than expenditure because of all this oil wealth coming in. But otherwise, green and blue more or less the same. The difference is a budget deficit, of course. But the Baltics are low tax countries and they are low spending countries. I enjoyed very much the presentation we had just before from Norway. Even as a Dane that I am, and therefore quite used to a Danish welfare system, which is generous in all sorts of ways, I was not exactly falling off my chair, but man, they spend a lot in Norway, and they do a lot. Would Latvians like to have it in the same way? Possibly so, right? Would they also like to pay for it? Definitely not, is my experience, right? And allow me to show a slide like this here. I like often to use the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report that tries to measure countries in all sorts of possible ways. This is a ranking then based on what do people think, what do they perceive in their countries of the usefulness, or in this case, the wastefulness of government spending. A good ranking is a low ranking. Number 1 is the best and number 2 and so on. And what you have there is what I've always thought was interesting, but what I also feel with my background is more or less true, right? This here that in the Nordic countries, yes, they tax a lot, but people seem to have this feeling that the tax money is actually being spent quite well. Denmark is a slight outlier there, not sure what's going on, but it's still looking much, much better than even Estonia, and certainly much better than Latvia or Lithuania. Many people sometimes criticize this index for saying, oh, it's all about perception, it's not hard data. That is true, but in this case, that's very, very important. Because if this is true about perception, then it could be that the ministries use the money in a quite useful way. But people just seem to have a feeling of that is just not the case. And if you want to tax people significantly more when they already feel that the money that they pay in terms of taxes is not being well spent, I think one will find that very, very difficult. The Nordics are, in that sense, unique in being able to tax very, very much and still convincing their people that the money is actually largely well spent. Most likely not perfectly well spent, but largely well spent. That is a very, very unique way of having it. I couldn't help also but coming back to this quotation from 2009, the former Justice Minister, Mr. Zeglinch, who sort of looked at when this issue sometimes comes up in this country, should we have a progressive income taxation? An absurd ideology, as he said, and the People's Party will never support it. Okay, we don't have to care, the People's Party doesn't exist anymore, right? But still, I have this feeling that it's quite widespread this year, that this is not a country that is sort of most likely in favor of progressive taxation. And I personally think that the country is not ready for it either. That's not to say that that the tax system is perfect here. I don't think it is, right? As I put over there, during the crisis, when sort of revenue measures and spending cuts and so on were on the agenda every single day, cutting the non-tax minimum, that was really, really tough. And it was really, really regressive. And it was, you know, brutal, as I put it there. And I still don't understand why, let's say, property can get away being taxed so lightly as it is. Also here, Latvia and the Baltics in general have chosen to be rather certainly un-Nordic. Fair enough, right? And in terms of progressive taxation, I just don't think the country is ready for that. But I don't see why it should not be ready for more taxation of property. Okay, when you don't have a progressive taxation, when you tax property very lightly, then you also get inequality at very reasonably high rates. Here again, the Nordic countries have and do use their welfare systems to try to reduce some of the inequality here measured by the Gini coefficient. Yes, Latvia is only number 2 in terms of income inequality. That's because I don't have the data for 2011, when Latvia will once again reclaim its position that it usually holds, namely as number 1. Right? But otherwise, certainly Norway, this very, very rich country, obviously uses its tax system and sort of welfare system to try to not take away all inequality. I guess I'm certainly not in favor of that, and most people are not, right? But take away quite a bit of it. But we do get then a rather unequal country here, of course. And this is something that takes place over the years. Sorry for the dots in between, but even Eurostat doesn't have all the data, right? And for Latvia, only since the mid-2000s. But inequality here is, yes, it's high, but it always has been, right? And in the Nordics, except for that little spike for Norway, which I cannot explain, then it is at very different level. In that sense, the Nordics are very, very different from the countries over here that I also, quite frankly, sometimes think of a little bit more as, let's say, like the UK or the US, which is also fair enough. I mean, not failing economies at all, just not like the Nordics, but again, who says we always should be, right? Where the Nordics, however, in certainly my way of looking at it, where they really, really shine, that is in the labor market. And it was also mentioned by several of you earlier on, right? The Nordics are really, really good at, if not just making people work, then making them interested in working. The activity rates, the participation rates, you know, so how big a share of the 15 to 64-year-olds are in the labor market, either working there or seeking work, it is higher than almost in any other countries. The Nordics are really, really good at that. The Baltics are not bad, as you can see by the green one for the EU27. It's Southern Europe that is bad. So the Baltics are not bad, but they could be better. And I really think they should. We know that one of the issues that is discussed the most in this country these days, that is demographics. And rightly so, right? There will be a demographic crunch coming up in this country, starting basically now. What's the best way to do something about that? Well, then some people say immigration, most likely not so likely. But try to get more people into the labor market. That would be a really, really good idea. Here, I think there's really something to learn from the Nordics, and we heard some of it just a few minutes ago. Let's say from Norway, for instance, this here. Well, do have kindergarten places, right? Do them have them so that both the mother and the father can actually go to work, create income, pay some taxes, and help the country, right? Shines again. Nordics are not just good at putting people sort of making them interested in working, they're also very good at having them employed. Again, we are sort of in Latvia not looking so bad compared to EU average. Certainly with respect to men and women, it's looking very, very good here, one should say. Gender problem in that sense is not really very serious, and I have this feeling that certainly when I look at education, if there ever will be a gender problem in this country, that it's, you know, it's with the men, right? That will be disadvantaged at some stage, but there we are. But again, something to look at in the Nordic countries, I think. And also allow me this graph here, just not Norway, Sweden, and so on, to clutter the graph too much, but only Denmark and the 3 Baltics, right? These countries, Latvia included, have never been very good at tackling unemployment. It's 20 years, 21 years since independence. This country has almost been independent for as long as it was independent during the first independence. But the amount of structural unemployment that has always been there has never really been, as I see it, a very serious priority. The Nordic countries are really good at that. Structural unemployment in the Nordics is very, very low. It's a complete waste of resources that we keep having in these countries, that structural unemployment is so big. It was only during the big boom, at the end of the big boom, that unemployment really came below 10% here. In Latvia, it's only 10 quarters of the past 16 years or something like that. Only 10 quarters has unemployment ever been below 10%. It's always otherwise above 10%. It's a complete waste of resources. There we should learn something from the Nordics, I really think so, right? At the end of my presentation, without going into details, since I'm not sort of big expert on it, I can just be a little bit surprised sometimes by some of the measures here, right? For instance, this guaranteed minimum income that will go from 45 to 35 lats. And to our Nordic guests, I should say this is per month. It is not per day, as it most likely would have been in Norway, right? But this will not get more people into the labor market. This is just a matter of survival. This is not helping to sort of increase the labor force, quite frankly. And as an sort of academic, I just also have to express a little bit of surprise at the fact that it's mentioned there at the bottom, one very, very large report from the World Bank, a lot of expert analysis done by, yes, people from abroad, but certainly also by people here coming up with a lot of recommendations. There is another World Bank report study in the pipeline at the moment, financed for $500,000 or something like that. What I don't understand is that it seems that a lot of these recommendations coming out of that doesn't seem to really go into legislation. Then again, we're all different. Even the Nordics here have pointed out to a large extent today, this afternoon, that they are also different. And even when people speak about welfare model, well, it's certainly not one model. It's rather four of them that have sort of overlaps. We never do things in exactly the same way, and we shouldn't just take advice from everybody else at any time. And there might always be country-specific issues and so on. But as an academic, I'm not so happy to see this here, that there is research out there, there is high-level research done, but it's sometimes being neglected. Right? It leads me to my final slide. You might question, why on earth is the euro over there? What's that got to do with my presentation? Not much, not much. Only this one thing, that Latvia is aiming for joining the Eurozone, might certainly happen by 2014. It also means that in terms of spending by the government, this will be constrained by this fiscal compact, and therefore whatever Latvia wants to do, it is in a sort of fiscal straitjacket, in the sense of never again, we hope, having very large budget deficits. Can it then do something by taxation? I don't know if it wants to. I've tried to argue that perhaps it will not. So it will always sort of remain a welfare state at a, in a sense, lower level than the Nordics. Personally, I don't see a big issue with that, but I'm interested in to see what perhaps my fellow colleagues would have to say about that, what you have to say about it, and what will happen about it in the time to come. Thank you very much indeed.